Our call to worship this morning is from the words of the Reverend Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister in Boston in the same tumultuous decades that the Reverend Joshua Young, about whom we're going to be speaking today, was here and elsewhere. Theodore Parker is best known for being so far ahead of his fellow ministers, and in that case the word is right because all the ministers were fellows at that point, so far ahead of the tradition of Unitarianism that in fact he was kicked out. He was invited to not be in the Fellowship of Ministers anymore for espousing theological ideas that we would find exactly right and not even too radical today, but it was the 19th century. He left the congregation that he was serving in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, a congregation that I had the privilege to serve for a year 20 years ago. And some people felt that his voice was important enough to be heard that they would start a new congregation. So they started a congregation in downtown Boston, which for some reason was called the 28th Congregational Society. I don't know where 28th came from. And every Sunday that he was in town, because he also lectured all over the country and overseas as well, he would speak to sometimes as many as 3,000 people. He was a big star, but definitely not an institutionalist, so that right now, if you were to go to Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters in Boston, I know this for a fact unless something has changed, you will not find any picture or bust or plaque to Theodore Parker. Store that idea away for today. He wrote this: "A Christian church," understand that in the 19th century, Unitarianism was absolutely part of the Christian tradition. They tried to be until they got kicked out. A Christian church should be the means of reforming the world. It should therefore bring up the sentiments of the times, the ideas of the times, and the actions of the times, to judge them by the universal standard. We expect, he writes, we expect the sins of commerce to be winked at in the streets, the sins of the state to be applauded on election day. Here, they are to be measured by conscience and reason, which look to permanent results and universal ends, to be looked at with reference to the laws of God, the everlasting ideas on which alone is based the welfare of the world. If there be a public sin in the land, if a lie invade the state, it is for the church to give the alarm. Here, let no false idea or false action of the public go without exposure and rebuke. But let no noble heroism of the times, no noble man or woman pass by without due honor." Let us light our chalice. As Melinda lights the chalice, I hope that you will speak together our words of chalice lighting. We kindle this chalice flame to remind ourselves of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to worship at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington, Vermont. Today is Sunday, February 5th, 2023, and I am Melinda Lee, member of our worship associate team. A quick historical fact. On this day in 2013, the House of Commons in the United Kingdom voted in favor of same-sex marriage. In what year? Okay, thank you, yeah. In what year was this right guaranteed to U.S. citizens? Who said 15? Correct, yep, 2015, that was the decision in the Supreme Court, Obergefell versus Hodges. Yeah, I remember the jubilation of that day. Unitarian Universalists come from many traditions and backgrounds, and we welcome all who share our concern to build a local and world community based on compassion, justice, respect, care for the environment, and who are looking to make meaning in their lives. As part of this concern, we acknowledge that the land we enjoy, where our buildings are located, and where the trees and shrubs stand in the bitter cold right now, is the unceded territory of the Western Abenaki peoples. And we strive to fulfill our responsibility to them and to act as good stewards of this land. So it's a pleasure to see you all here, and wonderful to know that more people are joining us through the live streaming in the service today and in the week to come. If you are here in the sanctuary for the first or second time, would you be willing to raise your hand and let us know so we can give you a special welcome? Okay, welcome. Thank you very much on a cold day. Our welcome ambassador is Deborah Ragioni, and she is right over there, okay? And she'd be glad to connect you, and any of us would be, to provide answers or any questions you may have, or give you a special welcome. There's also a card in the pew that you can fill out and put in the offering basket, and someone from our community can be in touch with you. We have few announcements. Unusually, our coffee hour will be held downstairs in the community room after the service, and you might have noticed that there aren't really any children here today, and that's unusual. And that's because faith development is happening downstairs, and it's beginning with family chapel for all children and parents, about 15 minutes of shared child-centered worship. The parents will be coming back into the sanctuary in a few minutes as the children go off to their classes. The theme for the chapel and for all of February in our community is love. And when you go downstairs for coffee hour, there's a collage underway about this theme in the Dix room, D-I-X, right off the central community room where the coffee is. It's going to be up all month, and you are welcome to add to it. So now let's greet our neighbors with a smile, a nod, or a heart tap. So we're about to begin. Again, welcome here, everyone. It is good to worship together.
I'd like to invite you to take out your hymnals, and we'll sing together hymn number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. Please stand in body or spirit. The words will also be on the overhead here together. Though I may speak with bravest fire and have the gift to all inspire, but have not love, my words are vain. as sounding brass and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess and strive in soul, my love confess, but have not give by love within. The prophet soon turns strangely thin. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control. Our spirits long to be made whole. That inward love mark every deed. By this we worship and are free. Thank you. Please be seated.
Let us pause for a moment, or two, or three, and use this time as a time of collecting ourselves, of noticing where we are, noticing that we are breathing and here and alive in this space together. The words of the hymn speak our longing. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control. Our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward love guide every deed. By this we worship and are freed. We come to worship together every week with the joys and the sorrows of our lives and the joys and the sorrows of our world. In this moment, you might call to mind something that even in this cold, hard week has made you smile and be glad. Something you're looking forward to, something you're grateful has passed. And you might notice and call up to something that has caused you grief, perhaps in your own life or the lives of people you care about very much, and also the world. I don't know about you, but I have been thinking these last few days, full of the fun announcements of how cold it is. Mount Washington breaking the record. Did anyone else hear that it was as cold as it is on Mars? I swear I heard that on Vermont Public. So that was fun. And for most of us, it got to be fun in our warm houses, in our functioning cars, in the ways in which many of us are able to survive even bitter, bitter cold. My heart and mind, and perhaps yours, were occupied with thoughts of those here and elsewhere who don't have a safe, warm, accessible home to be in, who must depend on their own courage and the care and benevolence of the community, which sometimes knows what to do and sometimes doesn't. I'm so grateful to the Sunday morning breakfast team who a few days ago said, it's going to be super cold this weekend. And we spent a day or two figuring out how to move the breakfast inside today. And it was inside. As some of you know, I'm grateful to the team. I'm grateful to David McFeeters and Erica Reif and Phil Vogler and all of the people who made it possible to have two things happening in the community room at the same time, setting up for Family Chapel and also the breakfast with all of the wonderful dirty, icy, icky stuff on people's boots that got brought into the community room too. Mark Cooperage, wash the floor, if you see it. Mark, are you here? So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that one little bright spot of benevolence. And I am also grateful and happy to share this joy, new news. I have his last name, Bryant. I was missing. Of course, I know who Cy is. Many of you do too. He had surgery on Friday. It went very well, and he is now happily recovering with his family in his nice warm home. So we're glad about that. I would invite us all now into a moment of silence. You might notice the joys and the sorrows you're holding in your life and beyond. And after the silence, if you would like to come up and place a stone in the garden of stones that we make together to mark a joy or a sorrow, you're welcome to do that. But first, let's be quiet together. The stones are clustered close together today. We hold each other's joys and sorrows. We say sometimes that in this community, the joys and sorrows of each become the joys and sorrows of all. That is an ideal, and in some ways it is true. Generosity of this congregation is an essential part of who this society is. We remember that every week in a variety of ways, one of which is to take up an offering. We do that to support the work of the congregation and also support in the community the organizations that are doing the work that we know needs to be done. The racial justice team has chosen a beneficiary this month that I think is the first time we've given to this beneficiary, maybe the first time that Zoe and I know about. Therefore, that's the history that matters, right? Sorry. It's the King Street Center, which is a nonprofit community organization in Burlington that teaches children and families core life-building skills necessary for a healthy and productive future. They serve approximately 120 children and teens each day, from toddler and preschool programs to an evening drop-in program for teens. King Street Center. You have an opportunity to help them do the work that they do. An opportunity right now. Your gifts will make a difference. Before we collect them for those who want to come up and put something in, you're always welcome to. You're also very welcome to give online or to write a check and mail it to the church. All of those things are possible. Sorry, society. But before we do that, let's speak together the words of dedication. With gratitude, we dedicate these gifts in the service of our mission to inspire spiritual growth, care for each other and our community, seek truth, and act for justice.
Thanks, James, for that winter improv. I could almost hear the icicles dripping as the sun was coming out. The reflection this morning is about the work of Reverend Joshua Young and his family, and other people who were part of what has become known as the Underground Railroad, helping fleeing people north prior to the Civil War. So Reverend Joshua Young's first call as a minister was to the New North Church in Boston in 1849. There he became involved in the network of people and places now known as the Underground Railroad. He became minister at this place, which was called the Congregational Church, the first Congregational Church? No. I think it was Society. Oh, was it? First Congregational Society in Burlington, Vermont in 1852. And he was here until the middle of 1863. So this was just in the midst of the Civil War as it was coming. He moved his family here. He and his wife, Mary Plimpton Young, had 4 children. So Reverend Tricia will tell you more of the story of his time here as our minister, and fervent abolitionist as he was, and his involvement in the funeral of the notorious and famous John Brown. Backing up a bit, when I first came here to Burlington decades ago, and I've lived here ever since, one thing I found fascinating was the fact that Burlington residents housed people fleeing north, fleeing from slavery, and that some of these buildings still stood. Fairly recently, a couple years ago, I went on a walking tour around this town to some of the houses that are still here. And I found myself in front of 98 South Willard Street, which I learned had been the parsonage of Reverend Joshua Young, Mary Plimpton Young, and their children. This tour was led by Michelle Sherburne, who wrote a book about the Underground Railroad in Vermont. Disclaimer here, I'm an amateur in this field. Amateur comes from the word for love, amour. And I rely on people like her, including our own historian, Els Curtis, and the UUA biography of Reverend Joshua Young online. Also, I came across a man called, and some of you probably know this, Raymond Zerblis. He wrote the survey report of the Vermont Underground Railroad in 1996. This was actually commissioned by the Vermont State Legislature to gather up all the information and really make a survey of who were the people, who were the places, when was this done. So that's all available. And also I acknowledge the work of Wilbur Siebert, who was a historian of the late 19th and early 20th century, who collected many oral and written resources about the Underground Railroad, and his work runs to many volumes. So when Reverend Young came here, he connected soon with like-minded people in Burlington, for the Underground Railroad was already running. And he continued his work in helping people escape. One member of his congregation, Lucius H. Bigelow, was an established principal person in this network. He had a large colonial-style mansion on Lower Church Street, alas now gone, where fleeing people found respite and refuge. It was very near where was then the Underground Railroad the real railroad on Lower Maple Street. He also, Mr. Bigelow also accompanied Reverend Young across the lake to the funeral of John Brown in North Elba, New York. Another Burlington resident whose office was near Reverend Young's house on South Willard Street was Salmon Wires. He sometimes kept people there in the inner room of his office because his wife and daughter objected to having them in the house. It was reported that Reverend Young also did not house people directly in his home on South Willard Street, but in a comfortable barn next door. One account says that the Youngs sheltered 1 to 6 people at any one time for over a decade. Another account says that Reverend Joshua was very active but seldom housed people who were fleeing. In 1936, the historian Wilbur Siebert met Abiel Anthony, a black barber in Burlington who was aged 96. His shop was on Church Street. Mr. Anthony remembered the work of his father, Tony Anthony, helping people escape. He remembered 2 or 3 people a night staying at his home, and they would be gone in the morning. Mr. Anthony Sr. was a free black cook in the Burlington hotels and on the steamboat kitchens running out of Burlington Harbor. And he was able to hide people in the boats, making sure they landed at St. John's in Canada. I have time just to tell you one story about Reverend Young and his companions in this work. And I quote, "One Saturday night, Mr. Bigelow called Mr. Young out of his bed to go and help 6 runaways who were hidden in a shed. They were led to Mr. Wyer's office on College Street, where the fleeing people dropped on the floor and slept. Their clothes were in tatters, they were hungry, and their feet were in very bad shape because they had walked many miles. Reverend Young brought them food from his house and probably had to wake up the whole house to do that. And then he and Mr. Wyers gained entrance of a store and brought them clothing. On Sunday, Bigelow and Wyers drove them up to St. Albans and put them on cars for Montreal. So the driving was probably in a carriage, and the cars were likely the railroad cars that ran from St. Albans up to Montreal. I have photos with me here in my phone that I took this morning of Reverend Young's house on South Willard Street and Mr. Wyer's house where his office was on College, if you'd like afterwards to see them. And later this spring, I'm finally going to give the walking tour that I promised to the auction maybe a year ago or so, and other people would be welcome to join. And we can visit the house and there's also the Benedict House at UVM and also the Converse home on Lower Church Street that were part of this Underground Railroad of helping people. So it was all around. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. Melinda and I have been having fun this week, learning this story. So if this story were a movie, I think it's easy to imagine the opening scene. Imagine on the shores, on a dock, shores of Lake Champlain, just south of Vergennes. It's a winter night in 1859. The weather is bad. There's a nor'easter brewing, the water is rough, there's sleet and rain pouring down and the wind blowing, and did I say this was late, dark December? There are, in this scene, 2 men arguing with the ferryman, who does not want to make another trip and take them across the lake to New York. Maybe one of the 2 men has the look of a preacher, with a long beard and a dark hat and a serious demeanor. It's pretty obvious that he's a preacher when he starts spouting scripture. I'm sure that they both introduced themselves. Lucius Bigelow, who was not only prominent in the community, but a member of this society at the time, and Reverend Joshua Young, pastor of the First Congregational Society in Burlington. It's interesting how many different names this congregation has in historical documents. They often say church, and I'm quite sure it wasn't, and they sometimes say Unitarian in parentheses. So these 2 men need to get across the lake that night. They're on their way to North Elba, to the farmstead of John Brown, the abolitionist who had been hung in Virginia just a few days earlier. It was important to disguise the train on which his body was riding north because there was so much interest and agitation. But the train had come through, and the ferryman knew that story And he knew that John Brown's casket had in fact been taken across the lake the night before. He knows all of this, the ferryman does, and he is not in favor of any of it. Possibly he was in favor of the hanging. We don't really know that. But he thinks, we imagine, at least in our movie scene, that these two self-important men need to just calm down and go home. But that doesn't happen. So let's start at another spot of beginning. Joshua Young was born in 1823, and he grew up in Bangor, Maine. He went to Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, and he went to Harvard Divinity School and graduated in 1848. That was, we think, was while he was at Divinity School that he became an abolitionist, one of those who advocated, organized, and acted in service of a full, immediate end to slavery in America. To be an abolitionist was different from just being against slavery. Young was a member of the Boston Vigilance Committee, an abolitionist group. And he was, as Melinda said, he was called to Boston's New North Church for just 3 years. Those 3 years were 1849 to 1852. In 1850, a very significant thing happened in our country. A law, or a set of laws actually, but one law in particular was passed in 1850. Anybody know what that law was? The Fugitive Slave Act, yes. So, in case you've forgotten, I will remind you that the Fugitive Slave Law, which was actually an updating of a law that had been passed in 1793, but it was much more strict and comprehensive in its 1850 version, it protected those who pursued and captured people who were escaping slavery in the South. I learned recently on a walking tour of the city of Portland, Maine, to call people escaping slavery self-emancipated Africans, which I like very much. So this law protected those people. They could not be prosecuted, but far more than that, it prohibited assistance by anyone to those who were self-emancipating. Here's a little bit of what Wikipedia says about this law. Law enforcement officials were required to arrest people suspected of escaping enslavement on as little as a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Somebody who says, that person is my slave, required elected officials to arrest that person. Habeas corpus was declared irrelevant in this law. And the commissioner before whom the fugitive from slavery was brought for a hearing, I didn't know this part, the commissioner was compensated $10 if he found out that the individual was proven a fugitive, and only $5 if he determined the proof to be insufficient. $10 and $5 meant more in those days than it does to us, perhaps. Here's another little note, though. Any person aiding a fugitive by providing food or shelter, as Reverend Young and so many people in Burlington did, anybody who provided any assistance was subject to 6 months imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. Little last note, officers who captured a fugitive from slavery were entitled to a bonus or a promotion for their work. So all officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate with this law. It was the law of the land. When the First Congregational Society, Unitarian, called Reverend Young to be its minister in 1852. It is possible that he chose to come here in part because Burlington was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, because it's so close to the Canadian border. We certainly know that he was involved in illegally assisting people trying to escape slavery, which was, it's important to remember, legal in this country at the time. not in Vermont, but elsewhere. It is unclear whether he sheltered people in the house. It's certainly almost clear that he sheltered people in the large barn. It's important to remember that this was the parsonage, which means that it was Reverend Young's house, but it belonged to the society. He did preach against slavery while he was minister here. Probably right from the start, but in May 1854, it all became much more urgent. Reverend Young went to Boston in May of 1854 with a whole bunch of Unitarian ministers from all over New England for the annual May meetings. It was kind of what used to happen before General Assembly. And during that time, there was a major event. A self-emancipated, formerly enslaved person named Anthony Burns had escaped slavery, had made it to Boston, was caught and captured and imprisoned by some slave catchers, as they were known. And this was a very public event, partially because of the Unitarian ministers in Boston who made it very public and who staged. They tried. It was more than staging. They attempted to free Burns from jail. Theodore Parker was one of those ministers, but there were several of them. That effort did not succeed, but Joshua Young and all of the other ministers saw this and understood in a more immediate sense, because they knew Anthony Burns. He was what this meant. So when Reverend Young got back to Burlington, he put aside his planned sermon, and inspired by what he had witnessed in Boston, he preached about slavery instead. He called the fugitive slave law, quote, wicked and infamous, a dark deed of sin, an act of treachery. And he went farther. He said that there are times when disobedience to a human-made law is obedience to God. Many other people have said that too, Martin Luther King among them. He said to the congregation, I have come back to fulfill a vow I then and there laid upon my soul to plead the cause of the slave, the cause of human rights and liberty with renewed zeal, to give whatever of talent God has bestowed on me and whatever of influence I am permitted to exert to the agitation and discussion of this evil, wrong, crime against man, sin against God, American slavery. I too am grateful, as Belinda is, for the many sources that I've drawn on. There is now a Wikipedia page on Joshua Young, taken from part of this wonderful resource that exists online called the Unitarian Universalist Biographical Dictionary. So people write stories that they know. And also, Els Curtis, and also the Reverend C.J. Staples. I've brought this back. Mary, I need to return it to you. I know that you're here. This precious document from 1910 of the first 100 years of this congregation. And there's another source, and that's the Reverend Bob Sangas, who in 1981 wrote a long sermon about Joshua Young. Does anybody remember hearing that? Excellent, excellent, excellent. It's long. But I've read the whole thing, of course, and it's quite detailed. And he talks about how the congregation reacted, as far as we know, to Joshua Young. He said, Bob says, there were some who did not appreciate his message. Even though abolition was supported by many in New England, including this area, there were also many in New England and in Burlington who opposed abolition. And some of them were in this congregation. A couple of reasons, at least, that we know of. Certainly for some, it was not in their economic interest because they derived their livelihood directly or indirectly from the industry that produced cheap, available cotton. And Some others were afraid of the social upheaval that abolition might cause. They were more concerned about that than they were about the social evil of slavery. I actually think it's not hard for us who live with the social evils of our time to understand this ambivalence. Many Unitarians, Joshua Young and many others, supported John Brown, the man who so opposed slavery that he tried to start a major slave revolt. That was what the attack on the Harper's Ferry Armory was about. He spent months organizing it and raising money for his efforts. I don't know that he ever came here, but he traveled all over Massachusetts raising money. He didn't tell everybody the plan, but they knew he was planning something and raised a good bit of money. And in October 1859, John Brown and his sons and allies did attack the armory at Harper's Ferry. How many of you have been there? It's remarkable how small a building that is. It was not a successful effort. People died, including several of John Brown's sons. So Brown was arrested and tried and convicted in Charlestown, Virginia. Having lived in Charleston, West Virginia, I need to tell you it's not the same place. It is Charlestown, and West Virginia didn't exist for another couple of years. You can still go to the courthouse and do the tourist thing, but he was arrested and tried and convicted there. And the whole nation watched this blizzard of news coverage because Virginia law required a month of time to pass between the conviction with a death sentence and the execution of itself. And John Brown totally took advantage of that entire time. He wrote as much as he could. He gave interviews. He said he was very happy because this was a chance for him to tell the people what mattered. His raid didn't succeed, but he was confident that right would prevail. On Thanksgiving Day, so that was in October, we're waiting for the hanging. On Thanksgiving Day, 1859, Reverend Young gave a sermon entitled, "Man is Better Than a Sheep," which is an interesting title. It may be insulting to sheep, I'm not really sure. But his point, once again, is that God's law matters more than human law. And he invoked the passage from the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus breaks the law of the Sabbath in order to heal someone and free them from suffering. He said that was the situation that he was in, that all of the people were in. And then on December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was hanged in Charlestown, but he was not buried there because his wife wanted his body to be brought back to their homestead in North Elba, New York, and so it was. But nobody exactly knew the plan on purpose. So December 7th, 1859, is another time that Lucius Bigelow interrupts Joshua Young's life by showing up at his house at the parsonage and telling him that John Brown's body was on its way to North Elba, New York, that Lucius Bigelow was going to go to the service, and he invited Reverend Young to go along, and Reverend Young agreed. They took the 4 p.m. train from Burlington to Vergennes. Isn't that nice to know that there was a 4 p.m. train from? Maybe someday. They got to Vergennes. They hired a driver who took them 6 miles to the ferry. But because of the storm and the lateness of the hour and because of where they were going and why, the ferryman, as we said in our opening scene, refused to take them. They argued with him. Brown and Bigelow argued with this ferryman for 3 hours. The whole time of the argument, the storm is raging, it's horrible weather, the ferryman says, and then the storm stops. And the clouds disappear, and one imagines the moon comes out, so Reverend Young runs up to the ferryman and says, "Now, we need to go now." And the part of the story that I can imagine is the ferryman thinks, "I'm never going to get rid of these guys unless I take them," and so he did. He took them across the lake. It was absolutely horrible. They were drenched. The sail was frozen, but somehow they got across the lake. But then they were on the shore of New York with, no Uber did not pick them up. They saw a house with a light on, and I think it was after midnight, so they went and knocked on the door of this house and convinced this person who answered the door to take them someplace. They changed horses at 2 a.m., and they arrived at John Brown's farm in North Elba at daybreak. The service was scheduled for 1 p.m. that afternoon. Joshua Young was the only clergy person there. Wendell Phillips, who was a famous abolitionist, he was there to deliver an address, and he's the one who invited Reverend Young to officiate the funeral. And so he did. He did. And he also consoled John Brown's wife, Mary. The words that he used to console Mary and his prayer at the graveside, which ended with these words, were printed in the newspaper a couple of days later. Here's what he prayed. May we consecrate ourselves anew to the work of truth, righteousness, and love, forevermore to sympathize with the outcast and oppressed, with the humble and the least of our suffering fellow men. So Reverend Young and Lucius Bigelow got back to Burlington the next day. Do we know what day of the week that was? I meant to look it up, because Sunday came soon after that. So isn't this great that we get to be in the movie set of this whole movie? Reverend Young preaching from here, but he talks about, years later, he talks about what happened when he got here and looked out at the congregation. He saw many unfamiliar faces, but even more noticeable, he noticed that many familiar faces were conspicuous by their absence. Things were different in ways that he didn't quite understand on that particular day. He wrote this story of what it was like probably several times, but at some length, 40 years later, Joshua Young did, just as he was retiring from his long and very successful career as a minister in other places. He wrote, "The next day, I learned what had happened. 6 of the wealthiest families of my parish had taken an oath and gone over to a neighboring church. Others were equally disaffected. On all sides, the arrows of public rebuke began to fly. On the street, I observed that old friends, seeing me coming, suddenly remembered that they had forgotten something and turned back, or crossing over, passed by on the other side." A Burlington newspaper, quote, "opened its batteries on me," he writes, "with a full broadside. My motives, my life aims, my principles were made the target of insinuation, misrepresentation, ridicule, and abuse. I was called all manner of names: anarchist, traitor, infidel, blasphemer." The blasphemer was for actually quoting scripture at the graveside of John Brown and consoling his wife with that prayer. Going to the burial of John Brown, he concludes, "I left Burlington a respected and beloved pastor. I returned to find myself in disgrace, an exile in the place of my residence, and little better than a social outcast." It's a little hard to understand how Joshua Young remained minister of this society for 3 more years. He did resign in 1862. He left at the end of that fiscal year, which was March 1863. We don't know, because he doesn't tell us exactly what that was like those years. Els does a remarkable job of telling this story. She juxtaposes the controversies with Reverend Young, which were many and various and about various things. She snuggles into that the story of the fact that the congregation really needed a new organ and was trying to raise money to buy this new organ. One can imagine having a minister who was notorious in a way, maybe gets in the way of your fundraising. As I say, I'm making up some of this. Because I think that his righteous anger, which he clearly had to the end of his life and that probably grew during the war, was mixed up with his grief and his real love for this congregation. It was all true, I think. I think it's important to tell the truth that the congregation supported him, didn't support him, but in general, they didn't know how to support his deeply held faith that when something evil like slavery was all around, was the law of the land, there are times when it's not okay to compromise, when it's not okay to stop talking about it. It's not okay to live as if things are going to right themselves and we can all sleep soundly in our warm beds at night. I think it must have torn him up. There was an interesting controversy. Bob Sengas talks about this at length and says that we can't quite know what the truth was. So Joshua Young has several more parishes that he serves. I think they were all in Massachusetts. The last one was Groton, Massachusetts, and he was there for 25 years. He was an elderly man, he was retiring, and that's when he wrote this memoir, and he wrote about what happened in Burlington. And that memory was published in Burlington. And the minister at the time in Burlington, I'm not quite sure who that was, wrote an accompanying accolade, basically, to Reverend Young about how hard it must have been and how important it was that he was an abolitionist and difficult that the city didn't, that the people in the congregation and even more in the city didn't support him. The editor of the newspaper wrote a letter disputing the minister's support for Reverend Young. And he basically says, Reverend Young must have messed up in some other ways too, which is why the congregation wanted to fire him, because in the city of Burlington, he would never have been made a martyr to abolition. Burlingtonians supported the freedom for enslaved peoples and were on record as doing so and fought in the city. Could not be. It is maligning the city of Burlington to say that they wouldn't have supported this man, so he must have made some other mistakes. And I find this remarkable and unfortunate that it was in the newspaper, but I'm kind of grateful for it because I think there is something very real about that. I think Reverend Young probably did mess up a bunch of ways. He was young, it was a difficult time, he did the best he could, and he felt betrayed and not supported. He had a family to take care of. He had a career that he was just beginning, so I'm sure that he said things that he might not have been wise to say at the Prudential Committee meeting or the organ buying meeting or whatever. I'm quite sure that he didn't stop preaching about slavery, and that was probably also hard for people. And it makes me think that this is how change happens, in a very uneven, very bumpy way, where individuals who later, when we look back, do the right thing heroically, but in the moment are caught up in forces that feel much larger than themselves and not always benevolent. When we make this movie, I want to make sure that Mary Young, Reverend Joshua Young's wife, has a good part. I'm not quite sure who we should cast in this role. You can help me. Joshua Young wrote, she was involved in the Underground Railroad. She did all kinds of things in the congregation because that's what ministers' wives did. She supported him, she raised the children, etc. When Joshua Young wrote his letter of resignation in 1862, there were two versions of it. The first version, which has disappeared, we don't have a copy of it, and somebody might find it, I suppose, but the board, essentially at the time, gave him back his letter of resignation. They said, we can't accept this because some of the things that you say about what happened, we can't support. So change it and take out those things that we don't like, and we'll accept your resignation. So he did, except the letter of resignation was, of course, handwritten, almost certainly by Mrs. Young. Peter is watching this service, so he'll forgive me for saying he and I can both imagine what happened that night. You gotta change the letter. I won't change the letter. Well, I'll change the letter, and something like that. The courage of both of them is extraordinary, and she among them. I will end with Joshua Young's words, which I put part of it at the beginning of the service. In this memoir, he says, I rejoice that no graver charge is made against me than that I have pushed the principles of general justice and benevolence too far further than cautious policy would warrant, and further than the feelings of some could go along with me. In every accident which may happen through life, in pain and in sorrow, in depression, in distress, I will call to mind this accusation and be comforted. May that be true for all of us. So may it be. A hymn from the time.
Hymn number 108. I invite you to stand in its body or spirit as we sing together, My Life Flows On in Endless Song. My life flows on in endless song, a perverse lamentation. I hear the real, the far-off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me roars, I know the truth it liveth. What though the darkness round me close, songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing?
Please be seated. I need to tell you that one of the things I've discovered is that every part of the liturgy in those days in this congregation was approved by the Prudential Committee, the board. in what order they came, and whether people were standing or sitting. So you should be glad that we're in 2023 and nobody tells you you can't sit down during the benediction, okay? Let's extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and share with the world until we are together again. For our benediction, the words of James Baldwin. There is never time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. Go in peace.